Today we're visiting with Ron Skaggs, class of 1965. Ron graduated with Bachelor of Architecture and Masters of Architecture degrees. He's a distinguished alumnus of the university, an outstanding alumnus of the College of Architecture, and a member of the Corps of Cadets Hall of Honor. Ron is a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, former president of the AIA, former chancellor of the College of Fellows, and recipient of the Kemper Award from the AIA. He is currently chairman emeritus of HKS Architects, where he worked for 45 years. Ron, welcome. You grew up in Dallas, and your mom and dad were big influences in your life, weren't they?
They were great influences, and I suspect that's not uncommon to most of us, as our parents being strong influences. Of course, they grew up in the Depression, and both wanted to get college degrees, but the economy was such that they were unable to. So they strongly made sure that both my brother and I were prepared and able to go to Texas A&M. And fortunately, both my brother Rick and I are graduates of Texas A&M University.
What made you make the decision to attend A&M?
Well, actually, at the age of 14, I had decided I wanted to be an architect. Being in a family that did not have the means to go just anywhere for architecture school, I researched the Texas area and applied to Texas Tech, the University of Texas, and Texas A&M. Was accepted at all three, and frankly would have been happy to go to any of the three. But the thing that made the difference is A&M gave me a scholarship, and that made all the difference in the world.
That's a big difference maker. Before you arrived at A&M, you really didn't have a lot of knowledge about the Corps of Cadets, did you? But you walked right into it.
No, I didn't. You know, when I'd watch the A&M Texas football game on TV, I'd see the Aggie band marching at halftime and all. That's about all I knew about them. And it was kind of a shock when I showed up at A&M. Actually, they'd had you fill out a card that indicated things about you and what dorm you were going to be in and so on. And it had asked the question, do you play a musical instrument? And I might mention, back to my parents, my mother had put a strong emphasis on music. So music was my other love, and I'd considered majoring in music. But I knew I wanted to be an architect, so I had decided to go to A&M instead. So I show up to dorm 11, unbeknownst to me it was the Aggie band.
Wow.
So my freshman year I was in the Aggie band. Now I had come here to be an architect, and back at that time outfits in the Corps, which was a 2-year requirement to be in the Corps at that time, were set up by what your major was. So I switched to an architecture outfit my sophomore year and stayed in the Corps until I completed my senior year.
And some of your first observations of leadership occurred in the Corps. You developed an appreciation for character, one of our 8 tenets of leadership. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things in being in the Corps is you go through a series of steps. When you go in as a fish, you're not a leader, certainly. But you begin to observe within that organization those that have a certain presence about them, a character, a commitment to building others that just was imbued in everything that I was involved in during the Corps. There were certain people at the sophomore level, people at the junior level, and even at the senior level, even more so, that just left a great impression upon me, and is a big reason why, even though many of my classmates in architecture were leaving the Corps at the end of their sophomore year, because you didn't have to, it was compulsory for the first 2 years.
Right.
Essentially, they were all going to concentrate on architecture. I wanted to still concentrate on architecture, but I wanted to continue as part of that, what I would call a leadership laboratory.
That's great. A great way to describe it. Who were your early mentors during your time at A&M?
There were many faculty members. Of course, there were those in the Corps that I just referred to, that the people of character that put their lives into me as a cadet. But as faculty members, there's 2 specifically that come to mind. One is Ed Romanek, who was at that time department head. We had not become a college yet. We were part of the College of Engineering. And Ed just left a very strong impression upon me to seek excellence in everything that I do. You have a choice. You can be an also-ran or you can seek excellence. And That was a strong lesson I learned from him. In graduate school, I met Professor George Mann and began to specialize in healthcare facilities architecture as a graduate student. And I observed all these relationships that he was making and these lifelong relationships that he was committed to. And I realized how important it is to be part of a community and have relationships with other people. And good leaders know how to relate.
Yeah, and that relationship with George paid off in a big way, and a little later you're going to tell us about, right?
Actually, he's still a professor here at A&M now, and celebrated his 50th year as professor of architecture. And well, actually, another partner and I established a chair sometime back that he was the first holder of, and we're working on right now trying to get another chair in his name.
That's just fabulous. You met your wife of 51 years, Sandra, during your senior year. Tell us how you met.
Well, I mentioned my brother was an Aggie also. He was younger than me, but I came home went home from A&M from the Christmas holidays, and he needed someone to join him on a date that he had, so it was a blind date. Best thing that ever happened to me. I really love my brother for that, and I love my wife even more.
51 years, you're still making history.
51 years.
That's great. Yeah, you work for CRS, one of the big names in architecture, one of the biggest architecture firms in the world, ultimately, for 6 months following your graduation, because you had a gap in there before you went into the military. You had some pretty cool mentors there too, weren't they? Well, tell us about some of that.
That's true. The reason I had a gap was that I was commissioned Corps of Engineers, but since I went to graduate school and specialized in healthcare architecture, I was branch transferred to the Medical Service Corps with an assignment to the Pentagon in the Army Surgeon General's office. But before I went on active duty to schedule it and all, I had this 6-month delay. So I went to work for CRS. George Mann was a factor in that.
Yep.
Some relationships, I mentioned his relationship building earlier. And it was one of the great experiences of my life. I had the opportunity within that 6 months to work with Willie Pena, FAIA, a great Aggie himself, distinguished alumnus, who wrote the book Problem Seeking. And from that, I learned many parts of the CRS process. I might just digress for a minute. When I was in the Corps Cadets in military science, one of the things we learned that really impressed me was if you're leading a group of troops, and so it's back to leadership, the first thing you must do is make an estimate of the situation. That's what problem seeking is.
That's right.
The second thing is to consider all the alternatives. That's problem solving. And the third is then to act decisively. That's managing the situation. And those are all leadership attributes that you learn in different environments, and I learned problem seeking from Willie Pena.
At that time, you probably didn't think of it as learning leadership, but you really were.
I was.
So your time with the Surgeon General's office was the beginning of your career in healthcare architecture, and after 2 years of active duty, you returned to CRS. What role did you play in the firm's healthcare practice and the development of that practice?
When I returned to CRS, by the way, I went as a second lieutenant, surrounded by all these generals and admirals and a sergeant major who I knew I couldn't call sir, even though I considered him sir. And so there was a lot of leadership that I observed in that environment as well. When I returned to CRS, I was put in the position of director of program development for the health facilities division, since that was my specialty.
Tell our audience about the squatters process. That's collaboration at the highest level, isn't it?
The squatters process is a term that was coined by the founder of CRS, Bill Caudell. And probably if we all remember our history here in the United States, there were squatters in Oklahoma.
Sure.
And he came from Oklahoma. And that was his term for intensive on-site design emphasis, or charrettes, wherever the client was located. So we would take a whole team of architects to the site, and for a week we just work intensively with the various users of the hospital in designing the facility. It was a really compact, compressed way of getting to a solution quicker.
Today we call that...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Today we call that collaboration.
That's right, it's collaboration. It also led to quick buy-in to the design solution, which is something creative people have to sell, and selling is part of leadership also.
Well, you also learn the value of architecture by team and the importance of creativity by all team members. How have those lessons kind of helped shape your leadership style going forward?
Well, architecture by team is something that happens in all endeavors of business. It's not one individual can accomplish it. Now, there were a few Leonardo da Vinci's in the past that seemed to be good at doing everything, but people have different talents. Some have talents for creativity, some have talents for technology, others have talents for management. And so what needs to be done is those talents need to be melded together. And the leader that recognizes that will get the best outcome in realizing that the solution is using a team. And
Bill Caudell really brought forward that idea of the troika of design management and technology, didn't he?
He did.
It was a hallmark of the firm. In 1972, you made the decision to join Harwood K. Smith and Partners, and you assumed a new role. What were you asked to do, and who was your mentor in that role?
Well, I was asked to come in and start a health facilities design group. Harwood K. Smith and Partners had been a firm that primarily designed commercial buildings, and what happens in any business is you have ups and downs in the business. And commercial work would have high ups and low downs. And by bringing healthcare in, the amplitude of the curve was more leveled out. So that was the reason Harwood wanted to start a healthcare group. And Harwood K. Smith was my mentor at that time. And Harwood was a very interesting mentor. He was very business oriented, although he was an artist who had studied at the Chicago Art Institute and had done beautiful artwork in his life. Very creative man, but emphasis on business. And there are a lot of interesting quips that he mentored me with over the years. Things like I came in and I thought we were going to get all these large hospital projects, even though the firm had never done any, because that's what I was doing at CRS. Turned out that we were not getting any projects, and he called me to his office one day and he said, "Ron, you have to crawl before you walk and walk before you run."
Wow.
Now, just very simplistic statements like that is how I learned from him.
And you remember those to this day?
Oh, yes. Another one, as I was out there when we got work, trying to do it all myself. And he says, "Ron, you have to accept less than 100% to grow." And what he was saying is delegation. And that's a very important thing in leadership, is realizing you're delegating to others. You're building other leaders. And I applied that, and the person I delegated the work to actually did it 120% better than I was going to do 100% anyway. So that's another thing you learn, is that by delegating and supporting others, it raises the ship.
Yeah, it's a good lesson underneath that. Harwood chose to retire from the firm in the 80s, and a three-person executive leadership team was established. You were one of the three. That must have taken lots of confidence and courage to move into that role.
Well, in my case, this is something I wasn't seeking. And the other two members of the executive leadership team asked me if I would join the group, which I was very honored to be asked to, but it was something I really wasn't prepared for. So certainly it took some soul searching. And what it really boiled down was, do I have the commitment to do this? And or passion might be another word. And I determined that I do, and I accepted that challenge, and it turned out to work out well for the company.
It worked out quite well. In 1988, the stockholders of the firm elected you chairman and CEO, and you really began to study leadership and develop your personal leadership model. You stated that leadership is the ability to inspire others to aspire. I love that quote. What's the most important attribute of a leader in your mind?
Well, I think that the most important attribute is service. It's essentially being a servant leader. Certainly, before you become a leader, you have to follow other leaders and you learn from them. And you must never forget the fact that you're there to serve others. You're not there to serve yourself.
You formed a leadership committee that established HKS's leadership values. And I know you brought some along with you. What were those leadership values? I know our listeners would love to know that.
I have it listed here, and I'd like to kind of go through the list if that's
Sure.
okay. I might mention when I formed this, I said we need to set what our firm values are, and I selected one of what I consider to be our future leaders to be the manager of that team, and I sat on the team as they developed the values. Interestingly enough, he ended up following me as CEO of the company.
That's great.
But here are the HKS values, and I think they relate to leadership. The first is excellence. Remember I said Ed Romanek imbued that into me. The second is responsive service, and the key word there is being responsive.
Right.
The next is work ethic, a positive attitude and work ethic. Commitment with honesty and integrity. Leadership itself. Having no bureaucracy. Remaining a learning organization. Mastering change. Having mutual respect and dignity, not only with the people in your workplace, but with all the people you work with in the business.
Right.
Providing career opportunities. And lastly, having a business-centered practice. Those were the values that we set, and they hold to today.
That's fabulous. We mentioned earlier that you had been very actively involved in the American Institute of Architects, and you used the term VIP as your slogan when you successfully ran for the presidency of the AIA. What did VIP stand for?
Well, we discussed earlier that I've read books on leadership, and one of the first books I led is on Becoming a Leader by Warren Bennis, which is kind of a textbook on leadership. And what I got from that book, and it wasn't in the acronym order we just talked about, was that a leader must be someone that has vision. He also must be someone that's passionate, and also someone that has integrity. And so I thought, well, I'll just flip those and make it VIP. And so that's what I was presenting in my candidacy for leadership of the AIA. It was my vision, what my passion was, and that I would lead with integrity.
And the marketer in you came out to form VIP.
That's
easy
right.
for people to remember.
That's true.
You and I share a passion for reading. What books, other than Warren Bennis' book, what books inspired your leadership vision?
Well, I brought another book here, which is called Leadership is an Art, written by Max Dupree. Now, Max Dupree was the CEO of Herman Miller. Bill Caudill, who I mentioned earlier,
Right.
one of my mentors, was on the board of Herman Miller.
Right.
One of the most creative companies that exist, preceding Apple by decades.
Right.
And what I gained from this book was that what leadership, you're leading people, and there's a human factor in that. And you must never forget the human factor when you're leading other people. There needs to be a mutual respect and a way of uplifting other people, not talking down to them.
Building them up.
Building them up. That's a good way of putting it.
So you read probably hundreds of books on leadership, but one book, Halftime by Bob Buford, did more than inform you on leadership. It changed your life. Why?
Yeah, and I have that book here with me also. This is a book that was written by a very successful businessman that had become very successful in his business endeavors, successful financially, but he came to the realization that there's more to life than just being successful.
Right.
That there needs to be significance in what you do. And that really, and that's where the halftime comes in.
Right.
It's kind of like a football game. The first half he was working towards success.
Yep.
The second half he started working towards significance. And that really impressed me, and so I began to, I'd already achieved success as CEO of a company, I believed, and so I wanted to start to get involved in activities that I thought had significance. Serving on boards, being president of the AIA, being active with capital campaigns at Texas A&M and things of that sort.
And broadening that community that you started building many years earlier. On a personal level, you have three sons, David, Stephen, and Geoffrey. They've kind of all got creativity in their DNA, don't they? What are they doing today?
They do. Well, David, our oldest, is an architect himself, which made me very proud. He's a graduate of Texas A&M undergraduate. He's now a senior vice president at my firm, HKS.
That's great.
Worked for 10 years with another architectural firm as I encouraged him before he joined HKS. He's in the sports group and is involved in professional and college level sports venues all over the United States.
That's wonderful.
Our second son, Stephen, in different type of creativity. He started at A&M and then decided he wanted to be a chef. So he didn't graduate from A&M. He got his degree from North Texas in hotel and restaurant management, then went to culinary school, and he's a master chef and now executive chef with Federal Express.
Fabulous.
And then our youngest son, Geoffrey, I kind of in a way consider him as the maverick of the group because he didn't go to A&M, but that's fine. He got a good education where he went. And then he got his MBA from Notre Dame, and he's now vice president of marketing for Fullscreen, which is an internet company that works with the entertainment industry.
That's fabulous. They all got great careers, and creativity runs through their veins.
And I'm very proud of each one of them.
You should be. You've had an opportunity in your career to lead creative people, which you and I both know sometimes is a real challenge. Talk a little bit about what it's like to lead a business that's filled with creative people.
Well, the issue there is you don't want to stifle creativity, yet you want to be a successful business at the same time. And sometimes creativity can carry you off into a realm to where there are not good business parameters being applied. So it requires a balance. It requires not stifling the design ability of that individual or the creative ability, but also aiding in bringing things to a closure so that ultimately a creative solution exists as well as a continuing operation. And there are companies today that are good examples of that. I mentioned Herman Miller is a good example of a company that does not stifle creativity, but is very successful. Apple would be another example I would give. And there are many architectural firms that are set up that way, and I strongly believe HKS is.
Yeah, well, I've often heard that the phrase, perfection is the enemy of good enough, and sometimes in those creative endeavors and creative environments we have to remember that, don't we?
That's true, that's true.
So Ron, if you could take a moment, look into the camera and tell our viewers one thing that's really important to you, maybe most important to you about leaders and leadership. What's that one thing? What would you say?
Well, there are a whole series of characteristics of good leaders, but I think the bottom line thing that a leader needs to have is ethics, strong moral ethics. We think of moral imperatives, the 10 Commandments from the Bible. They're the laws of the land that we must exist under and should exist under. There is the Aggie Code of Honor here at Texas A&M University, which says that an Aggie will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate anyone that does. Any successful leader needs to apply those moral imperatives in their business, in their activities, in their relations to others. If you think about it through history, not all leaders are really good leaders. And what I would leave it with everyone is you want to be a good leader. You want to be a leader that has ethical ethos in your life and applies those to your neighbor and whatever your religious beliefs might be.
Ron, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. You've held some important positions at A&M, volunteer positions, for example, being a co-chairman of one of our capital campaigns. What drives you to continue to give back to Texas A&M?
Because I will never return what I've given back to them to what I have received. And I can relate that to all these mentors that have mentored me over the years, dating back to my parents through teachers, pastors, scoutmasters, leaders in the military, and those that I've worked with as leaders throughout the years. They've imbued so much into me. What I can give back is just a thank you to them.
Well, it's safe to say you love Texas A&M.
I do.
Ron SKAGGS is an excellent example of leadership in action. He's a man who embodies all of the 8 characteristics of leadership. It's a sincere pleasure to share his perspectives with you today. I'm Bill Peel, class of '74. Thank you.